Hey folks, in this final video from chapter 9, we'll cover two last topics in terms of neural development, which are adult neurogenesis, and then we'll cover a couple of developmental disorders to show some of the complexity in which brain development can differ across people. So the first question is on neurogenesis. And if you remember, genesis means beginning, right? And so this is going to be beginning of neurons. And the real question isn't whether we get any new neurons. Of course, we do during early development. But if you remember that we develop many, many neurons and we actually lose about half of them. So we've got more neurons than we need. And for a while, the narrative was that basically we don't get any more, right? Once you have the neurons that you have, we're going to make new connections between them. We'll build up myelin, but we're not actually getting new neurons as we age. That narrative has changed just a little bit with recent research. So evidence for neurogenesis began in songbirds. So we know that in some species of animals, like frogs, neurogenesis is much more common, and we also know that neurogenesis and reformation can occur in the peripheral nervous system a little easier. But getting new neurons in the cerebral cortex, central nervous system, is uncommon. If you lose neurons, you're not likely to grow new ones. But Notenbaum and colleagues demonstrated, particularly in the hippocampus of songbirds, that they were developing brand new neurons that they didn't have before. This was later demonstrated in other animals and in humans. So in non-human animals, there's a lot of neurogenesis going on in the olfactory bulbs, which is where we process smell, or where animals process smell. This makes sense because those neurons might get damaged by chemicals over time, and so being able to develop new ones is functional, right? For humans, we rely on smell a little bit less than other animals do. We don't process pheromones through our noses as much, and so having regenerating olfactory bulbs might be less important for humans, but for other animals, having a neurogenesis there is important. There is some development in the striatum in humans. The striatum controls movement and also habitual learning, and so we can do some neurogenesis there with using adult neural stem cells. The hippocampus is another area where neurogenesis is fairly common, and this is in both animals and in humans. So you can actually develop new neurons in the hippocampus. That development can be increased by training, practice, and by enriched environments. And this makes sense if you remember that the hippocampus is involved in forming new memories. Now, not every new memory means a new neuron in the hippocampus. That's not quite how it works, right? But lots of experience and development can lead to changes in the hippocampus, including some neurogenesis in the hippocampus. So exposure therapy, for example, can form new memories, right, and new connections between your memories, and can also engage neurogenesis, actual new neurons in the hippocampus. But this is a pretty limited list. As far as our book communicates, at least, this is basically where neurogenesis is happening at a very sort of individualized level. For the most part, then, if you lose neurons in the occipital lobe, there may be some changes. We'll talk about that in chapter 10, but you're not going to develop new neurons there under normal circumstances. Last thing to talk about from chapter 9 are two disorders that can kind of help us think about developmental differences. This isn't going to cover the gamut of all developmental differences. Check a developmental course for that. But they're going to point out some of the nuances here where it's not just the case that people will either develop well or not so well, right? Sometimes neural development will develop in a heterogeneous way. And the two example disorders here are going to demonstrate that development is not just a single trajectory, but there are different parts of your brain and different psychological characteristics that are developing independently, and we can develop them in different ways. The first disorder that probably everybody watching this video is aware of are autism spectrum disorder, actually sort of a spectrum of conditions put under one umbrella. Um, Autism spectrum disorders, these right now have core symptoms. So if you don't have these symptoms, then you wouldn't fall within autism spectrum. You need at least some features of these two, and then there are other features that may or may not occur. So one of the core features is deficits in social communication and interaction. So difficulty with language, social interactions, that sort of thing across contexts. And then restricted and repetitive behaviors, interests, or activities. So really focusing on an activity, repetitive movements or stimming, that kind of thing, or activities. So these are kind of core symptoms that you'll see to different degrees in people with autism spectrum disorders. What's interesting about autism spectrum disorder for the purpose of a neurodevelopment chapter is that you don't just get bad brain development. That's not what's going on with autism spectrum disorder. What you're getting is impairment in some features and actually normal or sometimes superior abilities in other respects. So, whereas verbal and language abilities are impaired, um, people with autism spectrum disorders are often just as good or superior in other areas: pattern recognition, math, spatial ability, and somewhere around 10% of people with autism spectrum have savant syndrome, which means that they're incredibly superior in some particular task. Stephen Wilshire over here, for example, can reproduce a picture of the New York skyline and draw it perfectly down to very minute details after seeing it for just a short time. So this ability to remember spatial features and layouts like this is a savant-like ability for Stephen Wilshire. He's got some issues with verbal and language, social communication, that sort of thing, right? But he's actually superior at this skill. So whatever is going on biologically in his development is not general, but is having differentiated or heterogeneous effects on thinking. Now, what is going on biologically in autism spectrum disorder? Well, some of the risk does seem to be genetic. So monozygotic twins have about a 60% concordance rate in comparison to about 20% for siblings, and then it goes down and down the less related you get. But there isn't one single gene going that seems to be responsible for autism spectrum disorder. It's probably polygenic, and of course only partially heritable, right? 60% is not 100%. There are several neural differences in the cerebellum, the amygdala, the frontal cortex. There are differences in the fusiform face area that we talked about, seems to be targeted toward face recognition. And so there are some neural differences in terms of development of certain areas. Also seems to be maybe some differences in the connections between areas and not development of individual places. We do know that that these neural changes don't seem to be related to vaccines, for example. No relationship between vaccines and neural development in any systematic way that relates to autism spectrum disorder. But these neural differences may be related both to genetic differences and environmental changes that might be related to other things that aren't vaccines. The other condition your book walks through, besides autism spectrum disorder, is Williams syndrome. And Williams syndrome has is similar to autism spectrum in that it has heterogeneous cognitive features, but the cognitive features are very different from autism spectrum disorder. First thing is that with Williams syndrome, there are physical features. So you can see kind of an upturned nose and a pinky figure, and there are medical issues. So there are physical features that go along with cognitive features. And as I mentioned, um, whereas um, Whereas with autism spectrum disorder, you get kind of issues with social communication, but then not so much issues with like math and spatial abilities and that sort of thing. Williams syndrome has some differences where in Williams syndrome, social, empathetic, language, and musical abilities seem to be preserved or maybe even stronger in terms of social relationships, emotional connections, and language. But people with Williams syndrome tend to have severe intellectual disabilities where basic cognitive tasks, math, problem solving, complex decision making, that sort of thing is more difficult for them. So we've got, again, heterogeneous features where brain development is different, but it's not just good and bad, right? We've got different abilities developing differently for people with these conditions. Williams syndrome um, does seem to have a very specific genetic factor related to it, where there's spontaneous deletion of genes on chromosome 7. So whereas autism spectrum disorder might be kind of maybe polygenic, interacting with environmental factors, perhaps Williams syndrome seems to be a genetic disorder that leads to brain development differences. Those brain development differences involve general thinning of the cortex, which can account for intellectual disabilities, just less development of the cortex overall, but um, particularly in these areas. Then there are some areas here at the boundary of the parietal and temporal lobes where we process sound and language that are not just preserved, but actually increased in volume for people with Williams syndrome as compared to control individuals. So you can see frontal lobe processing, right? Kind of spatial math processing is thinned, whereas language and sound and music is increased. So these disorders aren't the only brain development differences that we see in individuals, but they point out that when we're talking about brain development, an enriched environment can help brain development, and a deprived environment can reduce brain development. But that's kind of an overall picture. When we talk about specific disorders, oftentimes what's happening is that we're differentiating where you might have issues with brain development of certain areas of the brain or certain connections within the brain. And so you'll get these heterogeneous features because brain development is not all just all or none. And that's it for chapter 9. We'll move on to chapter 10 next time.